Well, hello again and welcome to you all. This is the fourth and final session of our workshop entitled Hoodwinked, Exploring Our Culture's Profound Illusions. Today I want to sort of tie this up in a nice bow, and I'm going to do that by first summarizing this new understanding of what a human being is and what our true relationship is to the world. And then I want to point out and explore that when you look at life from a different perspective, there are different strategies that occur to you for living a fulfilling and happy life. So I'm going to see if I can flesh that out for us. And so we'll get started. So this session is about techniques for a new world, and it's based on the idea when your worldview shifts, new possibilities are revealed. When you begin to see the world that you experience as an interpretation, rather than external and fixed, different strategies for living more fully will occur to you. So let's look at that. So the conventional explanation of the relationship between a human being and the world is that the world is out there. In other words, most of the world is outside of you. So most of us in the history of mankind and true now consider this to be who we are. And so you can see from that perspective that most of the world is outside of this. Most of the world that we perceive is outside of this and therefore outside of ourselves from that point of view. Now, contrast that with a different perspective. And in this perspective, our sense of the world, our image of what the world is, our pictures of the world are formed from electrical impulses. The easiest sense to talk about when we work on that idea is vision. So let's talk about vision. So the standard story that we're told is that light is emitted by that source. It bounces off whatever object you're considering and it enters your eyeball. And what happens when it enters your eyeball? Well, it gets focused by your lens onto your retina, and the retina contains things called rods and cones, and those rods and cones transform that light energy into electrical impulses. Those electrical impulses travel along your optic nerve to your brain, and your brain constitutes or creates a picture out of those electrical impulses. That's the picture you're looking at now. You're looking at a picture that is a reassembling of the light that entered your eyeball, that got converted to electrical impulses and then back into a picture in your brain. So if you extrapolate that to all five of your senses, perhaps you can see that all you really have to investigate or explore the world is the pictures, the multisensory pictures. Multisensory means they're composed of vision and sound and then taste, touch, and smell. Those multisensory pictures that are constituted by your brain, created by your brain out of electrical impulses, those pictures are all you have. That's all we human beings have to work with when we investigate the world. You can't get outside of that system as a human being and get to the world as it actually is, whatever that might be. You only have your pictures of it. So that's the new explanation. That's the new story that I'm advancing in this series of workshops. So given that that's the new story, that we live in our pictures of the world and not the world itself, we can then explore what techniques for bringing more joy and more satisfaction into our lives show up as possibilities, given that that's the place that we look out at our lives from. So, to summarize, most people's view of the world is that it's external, permanent, and mechanistic. The new view of the world is that it's internal, it's experiential, and it's fluid. So this new explanation I'm proposing, which I call the seer's explanation, says that the only world worth considering is the one we experience, and we create it through interpretation within us. In other words, when I say the only world worth considering, yes, there is some world that we're perceiving. We don't know what it is, we have no access to it, and so it's really not worth considering if what we're up to is maximizing the enjoyment and the satisfaction that we get out of life. It's not worth considering because we have no access to it. The only world worth considering is the one that you are creating right now out of electrical impulses in your sense organs, and you're doing that in your brain. So, given that, what techniques might show up for improving our lives, for making them the best they can be? So I'm going to propose 3 tools. One is distinguishing between information and knowledge. The second one is finding and using leverage to get the work done. And the third is quieting the mind, which allows access to deeper knowledge. And we'll go over each of those 3 in turn. So the first one is rationality versus experiential knowing. We humans have 2 ways of accumulating, we humans have 2 ways of obtaining guidance. I wrote it better on the slide. Rationality gains information and sorts past experiences. So rationality is a way of working with information that you gained from what you read, what your parents told you, what other people told you, what you got off the internet, all of that, what AI told you, all of that is information. And rationality is a way of processing all that information, including the information that you stored in your memory from past experiences. Now, I would assert that that's a very limited domain. Contrast that with intuitive knowing. Intuitive knowing, I would say, connects to universal consciousness and universal knowledge. Now, we've talked about that in previous sessions. You may remember that I told you about an experience I had about 50 years ago where I felt that I had connected to universal consciousness by virtue of having asked or pleaded for an answer to a problem, and I heard a voice. And that voice only gave me 7 words. It was a voice of reassurance, but I'm clear that that voice didn't come from inside me. It came from somewhere else, and I can't tell you where that somewhere else is other than to call it universal consciousness and universal knowledge. We humans have access to that universal consciousness, and when we access it, it's called intuition. Sometimes we call it a hunch. And then the third principle is quieting the mind allows access to this deeper knowledge. And intuitive knowing is what restores our power. So this is rationality versus experiential knowing. Rationality is processing the past. What do I mean by the past? Well, the past is what you were told, what you did experience. It's all memory. So rationality is processing memory. And basically you're processing the past. Experiential knowing is processing the present. It's, oh, I see. That's how it works. That happens, that aha moment takes place in the present. So experiential knowing happens in the present, and that's what restores our power. Now, let's talk about leverage. Leverage is a way of magnifying your effort. So you have a certain amount of strength, you have a certain amount of ability, and you can do a certain amount of work, constructive work, with that strength and ability. But there exist levers that you can use. For a good metaphor would be moving a rock. Let's say you have a field, you're clearing a field so that you can plant your crops, and there's this giant rock in the middle of your field. The rock is too heavy for you to move with your own body, with your hands. So you provide a fulcrum, you put another smaller rock in front of it, and you take a lever, which could be a really stout branch, or even better, some metallic implement like a crowbar, and you insert that under the big rock, and now you have more leverage. Now you have more power to do that work of removing that big rock. So Archimedes is this Greek guy a long time ago who, with whom we associate the idea of leverage. He's quoted as saying, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." And here's an image from Wikipedia of this Greek guy all that time ago doing that. Now, that's physical leverage, but there's also a kind of leverage that we can use to affect the way we interpret the sensory input and therefore create the world of our experience as an interpretation of the input that we're receiving. There exists leverage that we can use to work on the world that we're on the world that we're creating through interpretation more than we can through brute force. So, acting with emotional leverage. Action taken to fix conditions tends to create resistance. So, for example, if you have a relationship that's not satisfying for you, or it's not working for you, and you want to make it better, you can take action like, could you shape up, or could you be different in my experience? But as you all know, I suspect, that sort of action tends to create resistance. And the harder you push another person to change so that they show up more in accordance with the way you'd like them to show up, the more resistant they're likely to be. Now, for best leverage, we can adjust our emotional state before taking action. So the implication here is that the power of the action that we're taking to influence our circumstances, our conditions, is affected by our emotional state. And we can be watchful for the influence of cultural illusions like scarcity and inevitability, both of which we've talked about. There's the quote that comes from Sir Isaac Newton, about 400 years ago. "For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction." That's in physics. And you can see that, you can imagine that, for example, if you imagine being in space. Let's say you're in the International Space Station, and you do a spacewalk. You go outside of the space station, and you're tethered so you don't float away, and you push on the wall of the space station because you want to move it in its orbit. What do you think's going to happen? Space station is pretty much going to stay where it is because it has so much more mass than you do, and you're going to start to float away. Fortunately, you're tethered and you won't actually float away. But the action that you're taking of pushing against the space station wall is going to move you back. So it's like an equal and opposite reaction. I would assert, in terms of this second idea, for best leverage, we can adjust our emotional state before taking action. I would assert that action taken from humility is more powerful than action taken from blame. So if you blame somebody else for your experience with them, it's not likely to create a lot of positive results. But if you do it from humility, if you adjust your emotional state from blame to humility, you may very well get better results. It's like, I'm sorry, I'm reacting to what you're doing because it reminds me of my mother, and maybe we can find a way of having this conversation that doesn't reactivate these old wounds that it's some kind of humility that allows you to be present and doesn't activate the defenses of the other person. Because humility invites cooperation and blame invites resistance. And then scarcity and inevitability, they are the content of negative self-speak. So you probably are aware, I'm very aware, that I talk to myself all day long. There's an interpretive mechanism within me that analyzes my circumstances and my thoughts all day long. And when scarcity and inevitability rear their heads, I call that negative self-speak. It's like, well, I'm not going to be able to do that, or that's probably not going to work out, or it hasn't worked out in the past, or something like that. That's negative self-speak. Now, acting with spiritual leverage. True change comes from feelings aligned with our inner selves. So we each have an inner self. And that inner self is not that which talks to us all day long. My inner self is not that which speaks to me all day long. The part of me that speaks to me all day long is like a recording. It's like a machine. You press a button and it starts to unspool. My inner being is not that. My inner being is the self that observes that whole thing and that contains that whole thing. So we are looking at a reflection of our own beliefs. When I say that, let's go back to that different way of looking at a human being and the world. When we say we're looking out at the world, we're really looking at the pictures that we have in our brains of that which we think the world is. And because the picture that I'm looking at right now, when I look out at this room that I'm in, is an interpretation of sensory input that in all interpretations are a reflection of our beliefs. Whatever you're interpreting is always consistent with your beliefs. You'll never interpret a situation, for example, that's not in accord with your beliefs about that situation. If you believe that the situation that you're in or the conditions that you face are consistent with a particular belief, like scarcity, like I don't have enough, or like nobody has enough except people who have too much, something like that, that you will interpret that situation according to that belief. That our interpretations are always consistent with our beliefs. And when you see that, there's nothing to fix about the circumstances in which we find ourselves except our beliefs. We can change our beliefs. We can remedy our beliefs to better enable us to live joyful, satisfying lives. So if you accept that proposition, then what remains as the purpose of acting in the world? In other words, before you accept that proposition that we're looking at a reflection of our own beliefs, before you accept that, the purpose of action is to fix the world, or to fix your particular place in the world, or your particular corner of the world, the conditions that you face. That's why human beings take action, for the most part, is to fix something. But what remains when you accept this proposition that you're looking at a reflection of your own beliefs what remains is to act for the enjoyment of being in action, to revel in the sights and sounds of the world, to love being and interacting with other people, and so on. In other words, in this alternative interpretation of reality, we really can act simply for the joy of it. Now, that idea flies in the face of so many cultural dictates, we can barely hear it. What do you mean you're going to act just for the joy of it? You have to be responsible. You have to make a life for yourself. You have to be this way or that way with other people. We all know those rules that we've absorbed. But it's enormously freeing if you can come to realize or make real for yourself that nothing in our lives is broken and nothing in our lives needs to be fixed. So I'll give you a case study. I'll give you an example. My wife and I have a rental unit on our property. And when we were going to live in that unit and manage a business in the larger house, but that didn't work out. So we decided we were going to rent this other dwelling unit. And our first renter said all the right things, and he was a nice guy, and we liked him, and so we signed a lease with him, and he moved in. Well, it didn't work well. He didn't treat the property as we wanted it to be treated, and he decided he would have whatever breakdown or crisis that he created for himself in our dwelling unit. But we had this lease, and the rules and laws and such, not so easy to get the person out of there. Now, we could have seen that whole thing as a mistake, as bad luck, or a portent of other bad things to come. So we started out in anger, but we realized that anger wasn't going to get him out of there, and it wasn't going to fix the situation. So we found ourselves adjusting our emotional state from anger to compassion. We found ourselves working on ourselves, both of us, to get to compassion for this guy who actually did have a breakdown of some kind in our other little house. And letting go of our anger brought us peace and resolution. We were going to provide him with the space we already had, so we might as well just let it be. And we tried to be as supportive to him as we could possibly be. And the situation resolved itself. He somehow got a grip. He enrolled himself in a program. He got well. And when it came time for him to move out, we stayed in touch, and we get cards from him now and then, and it all worked out. But I believe that it worked out because we were able to get from anger to compassion. And letting go of that anger brought us peace and resolution. And that showed me that emotional leverage is more powerful than a brute force solution that would have required an attorney and the sheriff and all this other stuff. So let's talk about another area of life, and that area is the relationship between the economy and self-worth. So we all believe that there's this thing out there called the economy, and that we are, to one degree or another, susceptible to influence by the economy, right? If the economy is not in good shape, we believe that we will find it harder to prosper or financially or experience financial abundance. A great example of that was what happened in 2008. I had some investment in the market that pretty much went down the drain. And so in 2008, I was in a place where I really felt the pain of that. I really felt like the problems with the economy had negatively affected my experience. And I'll bet there's others of you who are watching this video or here in this room that have had a similar experience. So the scarcity mindset, let's talk about that. The scarcity mindset stems from limited self-concept, that of an object among objects. What do I mean by an object among objects? Well, here's an object. And before we make that transition to seeing the world as an interpretation and within us, we see the world as real and external to us. So that means that this object is an object among objects, all the other objects in this room and all the other objects in the world. Now, if you're talking about real objects in a real world, their quantity is limited. Nothing is infinite in the real world. Nothing is infinite in the world of objects. And so the scarcity mindset comes from limitation. It comes from the observation or the interpretation of the world that the world consists of objects and those objects are limited. A good example would be, let's imagine that everybody in this room takes all the money, all the paper money that they have out of their pocket and put it in a pile on the floor. So now we have a bunch of piles of paper money on the floor. The amounts will be different, most likely. But if I now count my money from what came out of my wallet, and then I walk over to you and I take a dollar bill out of your pile and I put it in mine, what's the net change of dollars? Zero. There's no dollars been added. There's no dollars that went away. It's just we moved one from over there to over here. That's called a zero-sum game. And scarcity, it stems from the idea that there's a limited number of those dollar bills in the community or in the part of the economy to which I have access. Now, abundance, which is the opposite of scarcity, you could say, begins with a deeper awareness of the nature and value of oneself as creator. Now, remember, from this new point of view, we're creating the entirety of the world that we're experiencing. We're doing that as an interpretation of electrical impulses, and we have no access to whatever it is that's creating those electrical impulses. We can't know what that is. We only have our ability to interpret the impulses that do arrive in our brains, from which we create the pictures in our brains of the world. When you get yourself as a creator in that sense, then abundance begins there, because the degree of abundance or scarcity that you experience is a function of interpretation. There is no world of objects out there other than the one that we are making a picture of in our brains. We have no access to what might be beyond that. So you have a self-image. You and I have a self-image. And that self-image is associated with our personal worth, our personal expectation of abundance or of scarcity. And our personal expectation is what determines our experience. So my self-image is improving, and so my experience of abundance is improving. Now, what about the markets? There are markets out there, right? Yeah, there are markets in the world that we're experiencing. And those markets reflect the collective self-image. So you have millions of people, and probably bots or algorithms also, but you have millions of players in the market economy, and those markets reflect that collective self-image. The economy represents the flow of energy, and mistaken beliefs restrict that flow. The economy represents a flow of energy. Remember, all matter, go back to physics for a minute, all matter is condensed energy or another form of energy, stabilized energy in the form of objects. This is in the interpretation we make of the world. The economy represents the flow of energy, and mistaken beliefs restrict that flow. If you believe that you're not worthy of whatever it is that you desire, I say that's a mistaken belief, and that mistaken belief will restrict that flow and therefore your experience of abundance. Okay, so let's talk about the seer's explanation, which is this new idea that I'm proposing, that the world of our experience is an interpretation of something that we can't directly access. the seer's explanation of freedom. So we're going to talk about freedom for a minute. Is freedom scarce? It looks like that. There are some people who know that they don't have any freedom. There are some people who know in their hearts that they have some freedom, but not all the freedom that they want. And there are a few people in the world who know that they have all the freedom they could ever want because they say they have all the money or all the access to abundance that they could ever want. Now, let's talk about freedom with a little bit finer detail. I think it's useful to make a distinction between freedom from and freedom to. Freedom from is exemption from external control, interference, and regulation. So when you put up a fence or a locked gate or you lock your door, you're trying to create more freedom from external interference. Somebody coming into your space that you don't want. That's an example of freedom from. There's also freedom from what a lot of people consider to be more regulation than they think they should be subject to or they think should exist at all. So external control, interference, and regulation. Freedom from is minimizing that influence, that effect, impact on your life. Freedom from and restraint are two poles of a duality. So if you're being restrained, you don't have much freedom from whatever it is that's restraining you. If you have less freedom from, you're experiencing more restraint. And conversely, if you have more freedom from, you're experiencing less restraint. So that more or less thing is about duality. Duality is typical of looking at the world as something you have to deal with, as opposed to something that you're creating. Freedom from is about ridding yourself of restraint, and that generally takes work. You generally have to manipulate circumstances to get more freedom from, like putting up that fence or that gate that I just talked about. The duality is the hallmark of rational thinking and of being inside of an object-oriented definition of human being, and it's the signature of the ego. And what do you get in duality? You get a pendulum. If you, for example, have an administration or a government in Washington that reduces regulation, you get more freedom from in this context. If the next administration applies more regulation, you get less freedom from. It's a pendulum. It swings back and forth, and that's what typically happens in the electoral system. You elect an administration with less regulation, and that represents the pendulum swinging one way, and then the next administration does it differently and the pendulum swings back, and you never really get anywhere. You're just experiencing this pendulum swinging back and forth. The harder you push it to one side, the more forcefully it swings to the other side. And in duality, nothing is ever really achieved. There's just movement back and forth. Now, freedom to, by contrast, is about recognizing our own natural ability to create according to our heart's desires. So those are not poles of duality. They live in different domains. Freedom from is about manipulating the circumstances that you're facing. Freedom to is recognizing your own innate ability to create according to your heart's desires. That's a completely different way of being in the world. Recognizing our own natural ability is not part of a duality. It's just the observation of what is. So this new explanation that I'm proposing, the seer's explanation, says that freedom is choosing your own story from the infinitude of possibilities and knowing that you have the power to actualize that story in your experience. Why do you have that power? because the world that you experience is an interpretation. It's a picture in your brain. It's a multi-sensory picture within you of something to which you don't have direct access. But you do have access to that picture, to the contents of that picture, the quality of that multi-sensory picture. Knowing that you have the power to actualize a better feeling story in your experience means to come upon a better story, of a better life story for yourself, and knowing that you have the power to actualize it in your experience as a product of interpretation, as a product of the pictures that you create of the world in your own experience. Now, this topic that I'm going to spend a few minutes on is probably going to be the hardest one to explore as a human being, for most human beings. This is about reframing illness and the body. So in the standard interpretation of the world, which is that the world is the container for our lives, we come and go, and our body is part of that world, and we have very little control over that world. You may have noticed that. And as counterintuitive as it may sound, we human beings seem to be overly attached to our illnesses, our bodily conditions, and our diagnoses. In terms of the way we relate our stories to one another in the normal course of events, these topics are very often the first to be brought up. Hey, how are you? Well, and then you go into the story about your life, and very often the body comes up first. Well, I'm dealing with this issue, I'm dealing with that issue, and very often the body comes first, or it could be your finances. Those are the two things that are most impactful in this description of the world, where you have very little control over the world because it's external to you, it's out there. And it may be that this aspect of shared experience makes us feel not alone at a very deep level, that we can all relate to each other with the stuff that goes on with our bodies. Now, so that's the external view of the body. The internal view of the body, where the body is part of the world that we're assembling within ourselves as an interpretation of something to which will always be unknown and unfathomable. The body mirrors beliefs about the self. It has to. The body exists, in the terms of this new view, the body exists as part of this world that we're creating through interpretation. So of course it's going to mirror beliefs about the self. It represents yourself. Your body represents yourself in this picture that you have of the world. And therefore physical symptoms reflect emotional discord. And healing begins with a new understanding of one's self-image. That's where healing really begins. Otherwise, it's just moving things around. You may have known someone, or maybe it's yourself, where you have experienced a symptom or a collection of symptoms, and you solve that through medication, which now creates another problem or another set of problematic symptoms. You're just moving things around. You're not really solving anything. Healing really begins with a new understanding of one's self-image, because that's what the body is a projection of. So I hope that having listened this far, you are at least willing to entertain the idea that there is no out there except as part of the interpretation you're making. If so, you may also decide to contemplate the idea that the world of your interpretations is shaped and colored by your past experience and by the beliefs you hold. In that case, since your body is part of the interpretation you call the world, your view of your body is conditioned by those factors as well, your past experience and the beliefs that you hold. All right, so let's talk about acceptance. The word acceptance is sometimes a difficult one to come to grips with, especially in the context of stuff we don't want, stuff we don't like, some aspect of the world, or maybe the whole world, that we're not comfortable with. And I'd like to propose that there are two kinds of acceptance, active and passive. Passive acceptance is resignation to conditions. So the conditions are what they are. I feel that I have very little control over those conditions, and so I'm resigned to them. It's not going to change. I've done and am doing the best that I can. I'm resigned to the way things are. That's passive acceptance. Active acceptance is allowing what is and being open to unseen possibilities. That's actually different. So I'm not real pleased with the conditions as they are, but I'm going to allow them to be, because I really have no control over them anyway. And I'm going to open to myself the possibility that things will get better. And that I have not yet seen, not yet is an important way of saying it. I have not yet seen the way to a better experience of life or a better experience of my body. And creative transformation is experienced through calm awareness. So the more I can calm myself and not be so reactive to the conditions that I'm facing, the easier it is for me to allow those conditions to be and watch for unseen possibilities. People who look at scary situations, whether on TV, in a loved one's sick room, or just in their checkbooks, take for granted that it's the situation that's scary. However, according to this new view, where we're living in our pictures of something to which we have no direct access, the situation is just what it is, and it's the thoughts we have about what might happen in the future that are scary. That's a fear-based way of looking at the future. If fear is a function of thinking that we are at risk, then perhaps we can reduce those uncomfortable feelings by finding a better way of thinking about what's going on. And that way is active acceptance. So, there are some metaphors that can help us come to grips with this new view. So let's explore some metaphors that may help us visualize or try to get more comfortable with the idea that there is no external world out there that we're stuck with, that we're creating the entirety of the world that we're experiencing within ourselves. So let's talk about the planetarium. In a planetarium, you walk into this domed room with chairs that recline, and they're real comfy chairs. You can settle into this chair and you recline so that you're looking at the ceiling. And the movie that we watch on the ceiling when we're comfortably reclined in the planetarium represents the behavior of the physical universe. It's a picture of the physical universe, but it's not static, because there's a machine, some kind of machine in this room with us that projects light onto the surface of the dome, and those lights represent the movement of celestial objects, the sun, the moon, the stars, comets, whatever else the show tonight is about. Now, we humans can make that movie because we've been able to model in math and in metaphor all that we perceive up there. In other words, the night sky. Thus, we arrive at what we consider the laws according to which all those heavenly bodies behave. So the planetarium represents a projection of ideas into physical reality so that we can visualize them. You can look at the world of your experience, the one you're looking at now. Remember, the one you're looking at now, according to this new view, is taking place within yourself. It's not out there. It's an interpretation you're making out of electrical impulses. You are projecting your ideas about yourself and about the world into physical reality so that you can observe what those ideas are. Otherwise, it's really difficult to notice what your ideas are. So let's take your ideas about the world. If you may have ideas about the world, about how safe or dangerous it is, about how abundant or scarce resources in that world are. Those ideas are difficult to see within yourself, but they're easy to see when they're projected out into a physical reality. And that's what you and I are doing right now. We're projecting ideas out into a physical reality that isn't actually out there. It's actually in here as an interpretation. So that's the planetarium. The next one is the library. So I said before that rationality is a problem-solving tool using logical analysis. It's a powerful tool when used according to its design. It's like a research library, one that has collected all the works of all its contributors. Scholars look for understanding of the human condition in these stacks, an understanding that will enable them to gain the insights necessary to inform and guide the populace. That's like the Library of Congress that contains all of the recorded history, or is supposed to contain all of the recorded history of the United States. And a scholar might look in that library for an understanding that will enable them to guide us in our creation and our maintenance of our country. So, but our minds do the same thing with respect to our own guidance. This is how we dwell in the past. So when we rely for guidance on the past, on our past experiences, on what people told us in the past, what AI told us in the past, what we saw on social media in the past, and recorded in memory, when that's what we're poring over, that's like going to the library for guidance. But if we dwell in the past, if we look to the past, which is to memory, to stuff that's been stored from current experience in the past, if we look to the past for guidance, we're going to repeat the past. How could it be any other way? And the last one is the orchestra. I have a picture there of a symphony orchestra. See, we can think of all the thoughts in the universal mind as vibrations or vibrational modes of an invisible field. You can visualize this field as a vast orchestra playing an unimaginably complex piece of music. The air in the equally vast auditorium vibrates according to all these rich tones, with each instrument uniquely characterized by an immediately identifiable sound. Our ears and brains then turn that immense collection of vibrational patterns into first sound, and then what we think of as a symphony and a piece of music. We turn collective thought into the world. That's the metaphor here. In the symphony orchestra, we're turning a very complex mixture of vibrations of air into music. And what we're doing is we're turning our collective thought, your thought, my thought, the thought I've absorbed from you, that which you've absorbed from someone else, into what you think of as the world. Because the world that what you think of as the world is an interpretation. It's a picture within yourself. A couple more metaphors, the bubble and the helix. The bubble is a metaphor that relates to that each of us lives within a self-created bubble of perception. So there's the bubble of perception, and you can see that the people in that bubble are joyful. They're happy. The bubble is like an empowerment zone. It's the space in which you and I experience life. And it's like the horizon in that it isn't dependent on the geography of my physical landscape. It goes with me. So those of us who live in this particular valley, the Roaring Fork Valley in Colorado, we often talk about that valley as the bubble, because it's a very safe space. And relatively, it's a very productive environment. And a lot of us are feeling enabled and safe to be enabled in this bubble. And then we worry about being out of the bubble. But the bubble of perception that I'm talking about is like the horizon, it goes with you. You never can get to the horizon or beyond the horizon because the horizon always moves when you do, and the bubble is that way too. So if you organize your inner world, the world that you're looking at right now, which is an inner world, if you organize that inner world such that you're aware of your own innate ability to create a happy, joyful life, you take that bubble with you. And it goes with me because, like the horizon, it's a function of perception. And that bubble contains people, events, and conditions that reflect my beliefs about life, my story about life. And the same goes for you. And I think the last metaphor I have for you today is the helix. The helix represents rising awareness with each life turn. So we think of time as linear. We think that there's a past, a far past, and a near past, and a present, and a near future, and a far future, and it just goes along like that. But you may have noticed that in life, I've noticed in my life, that certain situations, certain contexts, certain lessons seem to come around again. Well, am I just in a circle? Am I just experiencing it all over again? No, because each time I go around, my perspective expands with experience. So this is the axis of growth. This is the axis of growth. I'm going around through my life's patterns, through my life experience, but I'm growing. So it's not like a circle, it's like a helix. That's the shape of a helix. I introduced it as a metaphor for expanded understanding. Life keeps bringing me back around to the same life issues, but each time I see them from a broader perspective. The metaphor of the helix points to gradually increasing understanding of the lessons that life repeatedly offers us. The up dimension into which the helix is stretched points to the breadth of perspective. The higher the level on the helix, the broader. Now, let's talk about what a human being is. Let's see if we can clarify what a human being is. We talked about, at the beginning of this session, we talked about the idea which permeates our culture, that this is what a human being is. A human being is an object like this with add-ons like feelings and thoughts and emotions and awareness and consciousness. Our culture has trained us to think of a human being as a thing, as an object with those add-ons. But from this other perspective, I would like to assert to you that consciousness is the true container of existence, and human beings are individualized expressions of that consciousness, of all that is. The world appears through actualization of story. In other words, you have a story about your life, and the world conforms to that story. Your culture has taught you that it's your story that conforms to the world, and I say it's the other way around. The world of your experience, which is an interpretation and which lives within you, conforms to your story about it. Now, what's this business of the quantum field? Well, the quantum field is just a term that I use to refer to possibility. In quantum physics, we learn, when you study quantum physics and dispense with all the math and all the symbols on the board, you find that quantum physics tells us that the world or any part of the world exists as a multitude of possibilities, and it requires an observer. It requires us to bring that multitude of possibilities and distill it down into the one possibility that we experience, that you experience. So quantum physics is about describing the world as a superposition of possibilities before the observer distills that down into one of those possibilities and makes it real. So the quantum field is a way of referring to all possibilities created by all the choices that you and I could possibly make. So now let's come back to freedom. True freedom is the freedom to create without limit. And life is then eternal choosing from infinite quantum possibilities. So you have an infinite range of possibilities that you could choose. Each moment, each choice that you make, in terms of how you're going to interpret what you're seeing, in terms of how you're going to interpret the huge mix of electrical impulses that come to your brain, in terms of how you're going to choose that, there's essentially an infinite number of possibilities. You and I think, by virtue of our acculturation, you and I think that those possibilities are limited, because we think that we are objects among objects, and objects tend to be limited. So life is then eternal choosing from infinite quantum possibilities. And the ultimate act of creativity is your ability to choose your own story and make it your world. Your story is your world. Your story isn't about the world. Your story is your world. And the world that you experience conforms to your story. That's how it comes to be. So we're at the point where we can make some conclusions here for this session and for the whole series of workshops. First off, leverage exists at every level: physical, emotional, and spiritual. Transformation begins with self-awareness. Your reality reflects your chosen emotional vibration and the story you tell to yourself. Let's focus on that last statement. Your reality reflects your chosen emotional vibration. The way you assemble a world out of electrical vibrations that reach your brain, the way you assemble a world out of those electrical vibrations is dependent on your emotional vibration. If you assemble that range of vibrations according to a joyful, hopeful, optimistic, inclusive range of possibilities, your world will reflect that. And the converse is also true, but I don't even want to name that. I just want to focus on the idea that if you adjust your emotional world, your emotional situation, your emotional vibration, let's say you wake up in the morning and you say to yourself, this day is full of possibility. This day is a joyful day. I will be able to handle whatever comes to me, because whatever comes to me is actually happening within me as an interpretation, and I have control over my interpretation. If you approach each day from that emotional vibration, your day will conform to that emotional vibration. Yes, there are other people having their experience out there, but you have no control over that. They're doing the same thing. They're experiencing a day that reflects their emotional situation. Your reality reflects your chosen emotional vibration and the story you tell to yourself. You're in charge of your story, and your story is your world. So be aware of your story. Be responsible for your story. Don't tell your story to the person who asks you, how are you, in such a way that the world will reflect the negativity that you embodied in that story you told. Don't do that. Incorporate positivity into your story. Incorporate possibility and openness and joy and magic and awe and wonder into your story, and watch your world conform to that story.